Hi, it's Debbie here today, and I have a couple of soft muted watercolour backgrounds set off by crisp clean white die cuts. On my blog, this post is part of a blog hop to celebrate the new Diecember release from Sam Says Stamp, and I'll leave a link in the description below to check that out. Backgrounds for these cards could easily be created by blending inks over a panel of card, but if you know me, you know my love of watercolours runs strong, and today I was itching to try out the new Daniel Smith hand-poured watercolour half-pan sets. I was so excited to see these sets being produced. For a long time people have been asking Daniel Smith to produce half-pans, and finally they have. So let's jump in and take a look. I have here the Ultimate Mixing Palette, which has 15 colours, and the Floral set with 6 colours. There are more smaller sets too, which I don't currently have. There's the Sketcher, Earth, Blues and Inspiration sets. The colours in each set are indicated on the sides of the packaging. Taking a look at the Ultimate Mixing set first, and there is an information leaflet which details the sets available. I'm impressed that the colours in 4 of the sets were picked by renowned watercolour artists. The Ultimate Mixing set was in collaboration with Jane Blundell, an artist with extensive knowledge of watercolour paints, and it was the information on Jane's website that helped me when I first picked out which watercolours I wanted to use. The information leaflet and also the little sticker attached to the front of one of the palettes details how Daniel Smith weren't prepared to compromise on the quality of painting with their watercolours in creating these half pans, and so they are poured by hand, the exact same formula of paints as their tubes, to ensure the highest pigment load. It's a labour-intensive process, with each half pan having 3 pours, but offers the purest form of professional watercolour half pans. Within the Ultimate Mixing set are 2 palettes. The first contains the 15 colours and the second is empty so that you can expand your collection. I don't believe you can currently buy individual half pans, but you can pour them yourselves from Daniel Smith's wide range of watercolour tubes. I must admit the palette is absolutely adorable. It's so dinky and fits in the palm of my hand. The palette has a lid area for mixing, and then each of the 15 half pans has its own well area to sit in. I was a little disappointed to see that there were no markings on the half pans to determine which colour is which. A couple of the lighter colours are obvious, but most of the colours cannot be distinguished from one another in their dry form. The palette itself is so cute and dinky, and yet contains a set of watercolours which could provide all a person needs. On the downside, I don't like that the lid of the palette doesn't lie flat, which means it won't be great as a place for mixing colours. In addition, I found the long edge closest to the paints doesn't have a lip preventing the mixers dribbling out. For on-the-go painting it would be great as long as you keep the angle right, but for at-home use I'd perhaps consider using a white side plate for mixing. Today I'm just taking a first look at these watercolours, but I plan on experimenting more with them and creating mixing charts for them soon. For now, as with any new watercolour, my first step is always a quick little swatch to fit into the palette lid so I can easily reference which colours I have and where they sit. I used a piece of Archer's cold press watercolour card and drew a grid of 15 squares with a little space underneath to write the colour names. I used Archer's cold press card, as this is the card I most often use, and so painting the colours onto this card will give me the best indication of their colour and properties. For each colour I re-wet the paint, and as you would expect with this quality of product, the paints re-wet easily. I then painted the top of each square with a concentrated paint mix, and then wet my brush for the lower portion of each square to dilute the paint. These paints have such intense colour pigmentation though that these small squares weren't really large enough to represent the wide range of colour saturation you can get. However, I still find these charts a handy little reference tool. Having painted out the 15 colours, I then erased the pencil grid and used the colours indicated on the side of the box, wrote the names of each colour underneath. The swatch then slots easily in the lid, and I have it to reference the colours and their position in the palette. Turning to the floral set, and I'm very excited about these colours as a lot of the time I do paint florals. This time you have just one palette along with the information leaflet and sticker. There are 6 colours in the set and spaces to add 9 more colours of your choice. I drew another grid on Archer's cold press watercolour card and swatched out the 6 colours as they are laid out in the palette. This time I didn't erase the pencil lines before writing in the names of each colour, and this is so I can swatch out the remaining 9 slots in the palette as I add more colours to it. Okay, so let's move on to giving these palettes a workout. I chose to use the Ultimate Mixing set as it has many of my favourite colours. I taped a piece of Archer's cold press watercolour card to a board to prevent it warping. I then mixed a dilute PYRROL Scarlet in one corner of the palette lid and a combination of PYRROL Scarlet and Quinacridone Gold to create a warm peachy yellow colour in the other corner of the palette. I then wet the whole of the panel with clear, clean water, and then using the wet on wet technique so that the colours blended together beautifully, I brushed the two colour mixes over the panel. I kept brushing backwards and forwards with the colours that they blended together to create a lovely gradient from one to another. I didn't want the colours to get too intense, I prefer soft muted colours, and also as my crafting turns from the holidays to the seasons to come, I want more of a spring-like pastel look while keeping those more muted shades I love. For speed I used a heat tool to dry the panel, and as watercolours dry they lighten, and I realised this was a little too light for what I was aiming for, and so I repeated the process again. With the second watercolour wash I splattered with water before drying to create variation and highlights in the wash for interest. Then after drying the panel again, I used white gouache to splatter over the top and to create that soft bokeh look I like. I then removed the tape and set this piece aside to dry while I painted a second panel. I repeated the process of 2 watercolour washes with water splatter over the second layer. After drying, I splattered again with gouache. However, for this panel, I used dilute PYRROL Scarlet at the top of the panel and then moving down to a mix of PYRROL Scarlet and Ultramarine Blue. This mixture created a lovely dusky graduation from pink to purple. After splattering the background with white gouache again, I made sure each panel was perfectly dry, and now it's time to turn these soft muted watercolour backgrounds into cards. Within the December release from Sam Says Stamp are a bunch of dies which I think suit being cut from white card to be placed over a watercoloured or ink blended background, or even over a nice pattern paper. I picked out the tree frame and sweet tulip dies for my cards today. Starting with a sweet tulip die, and I ran it through my die cutter 4 times with white card. I then used Gina K Connect glue to layer one die cut on top of another. I often like to add foam adhesive behind a die cut, but these die cuts are so beautifully delicate that the only way to raise them up for dimension was this layering process. I find it a little tricky to add the second die cut to the first one, but as you add the layers, the die cuts become sturdier, and adding the last layer is much easier than the first. I wanted this white tulip die cut to sit on top of one of the pieces of watercolour panels with a nice border of watercolour around the die cut, and so I pulled out the basic rectangle dies and cut the peachy pink background with one of the dies, which is a little smaller than an A2 card front. I added a generous amount of foam adhesive to the back of the watercolour panel and added it to an A2 side folding card base, cut and scored from Neenah Solar White card. I then used more Gina K Connect glue to add the tulip die cut to the card front. I used the grid on my glass mat to help me make sure I was lining it straight and centred. I used an acrylic block to press the die cut firmly onto the card front and then left the acrylic block on top while the glue dried. For the sentiment, I took the leftover piece of watercolour panel and die cut one of the nested banner dies. I then placed the die cut in the mini MISTI and carefully lined up a sentiment from the tiny word set from Sam Says Stamp, using a grid acetate overlay to help me line up the sentiment on straight. I treated the banner with an anti-static powder bag to help prevent embossing powder sticking where I didn't want it, and then stamped the sentiment in clear embossing ink. I then sprinkled with white embossing powder and heat set. I added foam adhesive to the back of the banner and added it over the tulip die cut. Because I cut the banner from the pink end of the watercolour piece and I'm layering it over the peachy area, it stands out nicely. I didn't want to overwhelm this clean white die cut card, so simply added a trio of iced sherbet sequins from Little Things from Lucy's cards. Moving on, and for my second card, I die cut the tree frame die from a piece of Neenah Solar White card. I trimmed the white panel down until it was a little smaller than an A2 card front. I took a piece of Lifestyle Crafts plastic sheet and cut it to be slightly smaller than the white panel. I then added score tape around the edges of the back of the white panel and laid the acetate sheet on top. I doubled up a strip of foam tape and cut it into 3 long strips. I added these to the back of the white panel and created a well around the tree area. I then filled the shaker area of the card with Enchanting and Pastel Paradise sequins from Little Things from Lucy's cards. I removed the foam tape backers and added a piece of the pinky purple watercolour panel to finish off the shaker area. I then ran the back of the panel with Gina K glue runner and added the shaker panel to a white A2 side folding card base. In the same way as for my first card, I used some of the leftover watercolour panel to stamp a greeting from the tiny word set with clear embossing ink and white heat emboss before die cutting with a little nested banner die. I added foam adhesive to the back of the banner and added it to the card front just below the tree shaker window. I really enjoyed using the December dies to create these clean and simple white die cut cards over a watercolour background. And as I wrap up this video, my thoughts on the Daniel Smith palettes are that they would be great for anyone wanting to try out artist quality watercolours, especially as the hard work of choosing watercolours has been done for you by experienced artists. I think the 6 colour sets in particular would be a great introduction. I'll leave links in the YouTube description below to the products that I've used today, as well as a link to the coordinating blog post over at limedigitdesign.com. I want to thank you for joining me today, and if you've enjoyed this tutorial, I'd be delighted if you'd subscribe to this channel. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.